I'm Pastor D.L. Barnett of Foundations Bible Church, and this is today's Prophecy Point. Extra, read all about it. Headlines today. Yep, you guessed it. If you were to read some of them today, get on social media, watch the news, get in the newspaper, check out anything surrounding what's going on in the world, you're going to probably be scared half to death by what the media is pumping out these days. In fact, you probably ought to be scared because there's definite eeriness in the air of what's been going on. Not only do we have the COVID-19 conundrum and all the flip-flop and flap that's been happening with it, we also have the George Floyd murder perpetuated by a policeman in a carotid chokehold for roughly 8 minutes that killed him, while he is now being protested that turned deadly with fires and shots and tear gas and rock throwing and looting. I just don't understand how there's a difference between the two violences. It's just sickening to me. We also have what's been going on in another headline. John Steingart of the Christian band Hawk Nelson says, "I no longer believe in God. The apostasy that Apostle Paul told us about is happening right before our very eyes." In fact, plagues that Jesus even mentioned would happen, like locusts returning as billions devour crops from India to Africa. The second round of these flying, crop-eating devastators has now surrounded all of that area, as you can see on CBN News if you were to take a look. We have the big war between Israel and our enemies coming soon because there's so much going on with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and all the things surrounded by the Palestinians. And yes, of course, those people who are causing trouble in Syria, and all of these countries seem to border Israel. We're being told to prepare to see high prices at the grocery stores, and it's likely that shortages may only get worse because of the COVID conundrum and the political persuasion and the pandemic that's happening. We now see this crisis not going to waste as its own horse rears its ugly head running across our economy as certain people refuse to open businesses for an economic collapse to push an agenda of socialism. In fact, these high prices are going to be due to the fact that they're killing off swine, dumping milk, and slaughtering chickens and the like in the poultry and even some in the beef arena. And we're going to have problems of shortage, which means also low prices for the farmers that are continuing to plummet while the price goes up and up in the supply and demand world-controlled economy. Then, of course, if you read the Wall Street Journal, you'll run across the headline of more people are taking drugs for anxiety and insomnia, and doctors are worried of what's going on with people losing things, what's happening in the world, not having jobs and the like, and the uncertainty of government, plans, legislation, and what's happening across the world. People are starting to freak out. Yes, we have the coronavirus monitoring bracelets that are flooding the market, ready to snitch on people who don't socially distance because of all this COVID-19 conundrum. And yes, we even have Apple and Google getting in on it with their COVID apps of warning you when you come in contact as a tracing app with others who have already been exposed to or have had the virus itself. Wuhan pastors interrogated after Zoom evangelism event. He says, "I will only live for Christ." For those who don't know, Zoom is controlled by China, and they have hacked it several times. I've been watching what's going on. And if you know anything about communism, the state is supreme, of course, instead of the individuals like here in America, supposedly, as we the people. And they are watching what Christians are doing. You have to be a state-certified church over there. Looks like they're lining up to do that here with what's been happening with Governor Walz and his slow open, if you will. Angry New York shoppers chase women like crazy Karens from the grocery store for not wearing a mask. They literally swarmed her, didn't pay attention to their social distancing themselves as they yelled and screamed and cussed profanities and even raised fists to chase her out in the middle of the grocery store. Just crazy. The petrodollar is giving way to a new renewable energy source form of commerce across the world, and it may be the very doom of what's happening with our economic collapse coming up. It's also causing stagflation, and it is caused basically by stagnant economic growth, high unemployment, and high inflation. If you know anything about small businesses being run down and out of business with this COVID-19 through these tyrannical little state leaders of the day, you're going to recognize such problems and struggles. You know what? One could determine the four horse of the apocalypse have come upon us. Notice the amount of deception, the amount of war, the amount of famine and pestilence, and yes, of death and disease. In fact, the easiest way to put that is found in Revelation 6, and we could say deception, violence, scarcity, and disease are only preludes to the catastrophic events of the last days. So if you would turn to Revelation 6 while we're here, and we're going to start going through a few of the verses on the four horses of the apocalypse and camp basically on the one of scarcity, pestilence, and famine, where the black horse and its rider have a pair of scales. But let me give you the scriptures for all four. First, in Revelation 6, verse 2, and I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Verse 4, and out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Verse 5, and I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. And then in verse 8, and I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. Hades is another word for hell. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by wild beasts. So with the amount of deception, violence, scarcity, and pestilence and famine and death, you can see just from the headlines alone, it says these four horses are on the charge with their riders, released by God. What does that mean for us? To understand that the white horse is the Antichrist and the one come conquering and to conquer through forceful legislation, martial law, as well as war and government political control. We have war itself as the main part of slaying, where peace that kind of rules mankind will be thrown out sociopathically and psychopathically into a form of great sword where people will just slay each other. You can easily notice that happening in the headlines these days with all the Chicago killings that are being ignored while the one in Minneapolis is having its trouble. And then, of course, if you understand the black horse and what we're going to focus on mainly today, you will find out that there's an economic scarcity and food shortage and things coming that we will discuss in great length. And that seems to be the one that is rearing its ugly head the hardest right now, breathing right down with its hot breath on the necks of the world. And now, of course, then the green one, where death itself overtakes through plague and famine and sword. And you can see that that is consuming the news, whether it's in deception or reality, it is there. And we have seen it for years and years, and it has all been running full steam ahead in a race to the end of days. So let's focus in on verse 5 and 6 and the black horse. Let's look at the color black. Maybe in modern terms you don't understand this, but biblically, the color black isn't like our conception as the color of evil or darkness alone. It's opposed to white, which signifies purity and good. Black in the Bible really means mourning and ill health as a result of scarcity. If you were to look up Jeremiah 14:2, Lamentations 5:10, and Nahum 2:10, all of these in the Hebrew describes people's expressions, their skin or their faces is black due to want. The gauntness of the baggy eyes and the blood pooling in areas where muscle once remained. And this idea of being emaciated is part of it. And this term of black is the amount of crying and ill health that's caused in depressive states because of what the black horse released as a judgment of God is to do. The reality of what we're facing coming up is nothing short of this black horse's horrible, judgment by God for those who keep rejecting him. In fact, the emaciated spiritual condition of the day seems rather obvious as people slowly abandon God's principles more and more. While we have a glimmer of hope in this time of revival from the COVID conundrum, forcing us to look to him in a different way and getting the church outside the four walls, as well as reinvigorating the church to stand up for religious freedom, the mass majority of the world is getting depressed and afraid and darkened and scared. If you were to look at the next part, a pair of scales that is in his hands, let's consider this rider on the black horse of mourning and ill health and depression on a pair of scales. In fact, a pair of scales simply means rationing through an economic system or a social credit system, both of which are being controlled in several ways through the World Trade Organization, as well as places in like communist China where there's a social credit system that's been out for a while. Our economic system runs basically through a select group of people that control it on the ups and downs. And we have judgments that'll be weighed out based on these particular things of basic food supplies on how well you rate. In fact, I believe it's going to come through the contract tracing and forced COVID-19 vaccine initiatives as seen as ID 2020 and Gavi and Apple and Google and the like as they push HR 6666 through the Democratic Party in this divided state of those who are liberal and progressive versus those who are conservative and constitutional. If you're to do some fact checker and online censorship watching, you'll see that they're fact checking even the president's tweets of his own opinions, and it makes no sense. In fact, online censorship, as some of the headlines talk about, is YouTube not allowing certain conservative things to be said, as well as Facebook silencing some of them. And who owns these third-party fact checkers and gives people the right to censorship? Makes you scared a little bit to understand that what you say that could be truth could be pushed behind the dark cloud of mourning. Intentional media narratives that seem to be running all aspects of the media today, except those that are in a different state of understanding and paying attention and researching behind the scenes. Sadly, we have this pair of scales that is weighing our thoughts and our actions, not necessarily through, the right sources. If you were to look at the propaganda of Nazi Germany and Russia and the like, and even some of our World War I and II propaganda from America, and just pay close attention to what's being played out in the media, you're going to see that they may use this to determine by what we say in our social media who's who and who's not. In fact, maybe even some of the red flag laws and checking in those particular things of systematic socialistic implementations where they raise the prices and inflation through stagnation that this COVID conundrum has caused, and now forcing us to look to the state for salvation of just basic life as small businesses deteriorate and people are paid more to stay home. And I'm guessing they're paying close attention. And when that contract tracing comes, it's not what's in the bill, it's the vagueness of it and what's not in it that is so scary. You should check that out yourself. But a pair of scales through this world's eyes instead of God's in the scriptures might be exactly what the problem is. And there'll be a lack of balance between the two if you think about it. In fact, the idea of a lack of balance between the elites and the non-elites is very, very real. Those who have and those who have not, who are forced to have not and will not kowtow to the state. Next comes, and he hears a voice that seemed to be in the midst of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarii, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarii. And do not harm the oil and wine. Well, so what is a denarii? Well, in John's time, it equaled the price of 10 donkeys. That wasn't seeming so bad, but a little coin, a little silver coin, could buy 10 donkeys from that day. And so, at a minimum, this would be $1,000 today, because a foal or of a donkey or a little baby donkey is about $100 in the markets. At a maximum, this could be up to $3,000 today, as some of them were $300 as well as they grew, if not up to $30,000 for well-trained ones that were maybe $3,000 apiece. In Matthew 10:2, it tells us that a day's wages, which is approximately 10 hours and sometimes from dawn to dusk, that was the equivalent of a denarii. In Minnesota, at minimum, this would be $81.50 for a day's wages, with the state minimum wage being $8.15 for smaller businesses, and for large businesses, $10. So that would make a maximum of $100 for a day's wages. Now, during parts of the history of Rome, food costs were so high that without free wheat subsidies from the government, the common people would not have been able to survive. There's been several studies done about how much the cost of living was in comparison to the wages earned. And if you were to try to compare maybe a soldier of that day to now, they got, say, 93,000 denarii, which was, seemed like a lot, but it was at least $5 a loaf of bread then. And so for the large families and the way they did things then, it would cost more to feed than it would to do anything else. And without government stepping in, they couldn't make it. What does this mean for us? Well, the same reality of headlines that we're facing today, as we've seen inflation and costs of food going up with the COVID conundrum pushing it, it's very much the same thing. Consider a couple tidbits of trivia for you. 50 cents per gallon of gas tax. How about what Obama wrote in his Dreams of the Father book about us accepting 100% tax as long as the government provided everything for us? In fact, the reality of what the socialist agenda and what COVID conundrum is pushing is the same thing. In other words, the Bible is saying that a quart of wheat, which gives you a day's rations of bread, one person, 3 quarts of barley would cover 3 square meals of a person. You have a reality of it taking 100% of a person's wages to supply a whole household with just sufficient food at the prophesied time here. You can see that our government and the Worldwide Trade Center and those who are in charge are pushing more and more towards this. Maybe we need to pay attention a little closer to the economic black horse that seems to be running roughshod over our society. Well, now let's take a look at the do not harm the oil and wine statement at the end of the verse. Not only will it take a person's 1 meal quart of wheat and its quarts of barley that would suffice for a day's meals for a family, and that's it. We also have the oil and wine. In fact, due to the cost of wheat and barley, there'll be no funds left to buy the oil and the wine. Bread and water existence due to shortages will be par for the course as this comes along. In fact, these items are luxury items, if you will. Paul in 1 Timothy expresses the reality of a narcissistic society and its total hedonistic and pleasure-driven ways, that they'll prefer these over just the daily bread. Some interpret this to say there'll be odd shortages of basic foods and exorbitant amounts of the extra foods that are supplements that aren't the main portion of what somebody needs. In fact, that goes along with the spiritual understanding of the famine of the word of the Lord and bread of life, which comes from God, the manna from heaven, and the meat of the word all being, not there, and that we need to pay attention to that. But the oil and the wine of this life's luxuries will be prevalent. Look at what happened with the COVID conundrum. They said they had to close down places certain places like Colorado Springs, you couldn't even go to the grocery store. And now you can finally do that, but you can only do it in certain amounts, and you're only allowed to buy one piece of chicken or one type of meat at a time and things like that, as though they have the right to ration out what we want to purchase. The reality is they left the state liquor stores wide open, the pot palaces wide open for people to get their pleasure from getting stoned, or their medical marijuana dispensaries, as well as some of the other things like restaurants. You could still go and get a square meal that way, but you just couldn't buy your own things. So in other words, you have to trust everybody else to give you the luxuries and the extras, but you can't take care of yourself. And we want to keep you from doing that. Maybe there's more to this black horse than we realize. In fact, these items drive commerce and stock if you really pay attention. The oil and the wine, the oil of the petrodollar, and stagflation and COVID-19, and the cause and effect of governed economic controls that are raising up and down the stock markets through buying and selling, and how the oil prices of the crude oil drive what we do. Not to mention all the other things of, think of the juice and the wine and the liquor industry and those things. There's some serious connotations about, there's going to be an unequal scale of these things versus the daily needed bread of life. Very, very interesting to see how that's playing out before our very eyes in this prophetic point. In fact, the very next thing that we need to understand is the global circumstance will hold both food and supply in unbalanced proportions, of the elites with plenty and the rest of us in want, under a system of economic and systematic control of sustenance. That's really what this is all about with the black horse. Maybe it's already riding, maybe it's its foal, but we must be prepared for what is coming. Experts are all saying in the next 6 to 9 months, inflation and cost of food is going to go up, and the shortage of meats will be apparent, and the economic disaster that is looming will come across the world in tremendous ways, especially as they're already telling us the narrative of the second COVID-19 conundrum that's coming. How do they know it is? And why? These are all the questions that come out of the black horse riding in this prophetic point. I'm Pastor D.L. Barnett of Foundations Bible Church. Remember, God loves you, and so do I. Keep your eyes on the sky, because soon it'll be time to fly.